They called him a fool for buying rusted equipment. 6 years later, he owned the county. The auction started at 8 in the morning on a cold March Saturday in 1981. Not the kind of cold that comes with snow, the kind that comes after it. Melt freeze overnight. Tire tracks locked into mud. Frost still coating the fence posts at the Perkins estate on the eastern edge of Decatur County, Indiana. Delbert Crane arrived before anyone else did. He was 47 years old that March, had farmed the same 180 acres east of Greensburg since 1961, the year his father signed over the deed and moved to Florida. The land was paid for. The farmhouse was paid for. The 1972 Case 870 sitting in his machinery shed was paid for. What Del did not have was a working planter, a disc harrow in any condition worth using, or a combine that would last another season. The 1968 John Deere 55 in his barn had thrown a drive chain in October 1980. The replacement parts cost more than the machine was worth. He was at the Perkins auction because he needed equipment. He arrived early because he wanted to look before anyone else started bidding. The Perkins farm had operated on 320 acres for 41 years. Harold Perkins died in January 1981 with no will and 3 grown children in Columbus, Indianapolis, and Phoenix. The estate attorney scheduled the auction for late March. Everything on the property was to be sold. There was a lot of equipment. Some of it was decent. A 1975 International Harvester 1066 tractor with 6,400 hours on the meter. A grain wagon in good condition. A set of field cultivators that looked serviceable. Most of it was not decent. Behind the machine shed, across 2 rough rows in a frozen field, were the machines Harold Perkins had been accumulating and abandoning for 30 years. 3 tractors in various states of decay. A 1949 Farmall M with no hood and the front axle rusted solid. A 1957 John Deere 620 with a cracked block. A 1963 Oliver 1800 that had sat in the same spot long enough to grow grass through the floorboards. Alongside them, a 4-row corn planter from the mid-1960s with bent row units. A disc harrow with several blades cracked or missing. A field cultivator that was more rust than steel. A Peto-driven grain auger with no motor and both bearings seized. Del walked through all of it for 40 minutes before the bidding opened. He was not the only one looking. 11 other farmers from the county had come to the auction. Most of them walked through the back rows, saw the rust, and returned to stand near the International 1066 up front. 2 men in matching green caps laughed at something near the Oliver 1800. They moved on quickly. Del kept walking. He had a yellow legal pad with him. He wrote things on it as he moved through the rows. Dimensions he could read. Part numbers where the decals hadn't faded completely. He got down on his back in the frozen mud beneath the Oliver 1800 and looked at the frame for 11 minutes. The mud was cold enough to feel through his canvas jacket. He spent 8 minutes on the corn planter, worked through each row unit by hand, counting what was bent past repair and what was only rusted over. The count: 4 units bent beyond use, 8 salvageable. He wrote that down. He had another notebook at home, had been keeping it since July 1980 when farm loan rates began climbing past 14%. By December 1980, the USTA rate stood at 17.25%. By February 1981, private lenders in Indiana were writing equipment notes at 18 and 19%. Del had written those numbers in the notebook alongside a column showing what a $40,000 equipment loan cost at 18.5% per year. The interest alone came to $7,400 annually before any principal. He'd talked to 3 neighbors in the fall of 1980. Roy Grisham, 320 acres to the east, was financing the 1975 International from this same auction. Frank Elmore to the south was looking at a new combine. Bud Stillwaters to the north had already signed a note for $62,000 to buy equipment and expand his planted acres. Del had asked Bud about the rates. Bud told him it would work out. Del wrote that down too. The bidding opened at 9:15. Carl Whitfield from Whitfield Farm Supply in Greensburg stood near the front. Had been selling equipment in Decatur County for 22 years. He watched Del Crane walk back from the Rust Rose and said something to the man standing next to him. Del didn't hear it. Didn't need to. The 1975 International 1066 went first. Final bid, $14,800. Roy Grisham. He'd taken a loan in February at 5% to cover the purchase. He needed that tractor. He got it. The decent equipment moved fast and high. By 11 in the morning, it was gone. The auctioneer moved to the Rust Rose. The 1949 Farmall M went first. No one opened. Del offered $40. Nobody countered. He got it for $40. The 1957 John Deere 620 had two bidders for about 30 seconds. Del ended it at $75. The 1963 Oliver 1800 had a moment of silence after the auctioneer called it. A man in a green deer cap said something to his neighbor. Both of them smiled at the machine. Del bid $200. A farmer from the western end of the county bid $225. Del bid $250. That was the end of that. The corn planter, disc harrow, field cultivator, and auger went as a lot. Del opened at $800. Carl Whitfield told the man beside him the lot wasn't worth $100. Nobody countered the $800. Del drove home that afternoon with a trailer loaded with rust. Frozen tire ruts the whole way back. The total he'd paid across all 5 purchases, $1,365. He had the Oliver 1800 inside his machine shed by Sunday evening. The Oliver was the priority. His Case 870 could handle field prep, but a second tractor for planting season was the gap he needed to close. If the Oliver ran, that was the question he'd been working on since he'd spent those 11 minutes on his back looking at the frame. The frame was sound. He'd seen enough cracked blocks to know the sound of the knock they make on cold starts. The Oliver hadn't knocked when he tried the key at the auction on a borrowed battery. It had turned over freely, hadn't fired. But it had turned. He spent the first week diagnosing. The fuel system was varnished from years of sitting. The carburetor was clogged throughout. The distributor points were corroded past usefulness. The battery tray had rusted through, but the block itself was dry. He pulled the valve cover. Nothing warped. Nothing bent. He ordered points and condenser from an aftermarket supplier in Fort Wayne. Parts arrived in 4 days. Cost $14. A carburetor kit from the same supplier, $23. The battery tray he fabricated from a piece of plate steel in his own shed. 2 hours of work. No parts cost. He worked on the Oliver on evenings and Saturdays through March and into April. 4 to 5 hours at a stretch. The shed smelled of old oil and cold concrete. He used a trouble light strung over the engine bay. His tools were a set of Craftsman combination wrenches his father had left behind in 1961. By the first week of May, the Oliver 1800 started. He let it run for 25 minutes, checked the hydraulics, checked the 3-point hitch, watched the oil pressure gauge settle, ran it through all 6 gears with the shed doors open, shut it off, started it again the next morning on its own battery. Cold, it ran. The Farmall M had a failed head gasket, a known repair. Del pulled the head over a weekend in April and trucked it to a machine shop in Columbus, Indiana, 31 miles east. Had it resurfaced for $55. New gasket, $22. He had the Farmall running by the last week of April. He parked it in the back corner of the shed. It was a backup and a parts machine. He'd known that from the day he paid $40 for it. But a running backup cost nothing beyond what he'd already spent. The 1957 John Deere 620 had a cracked block, not repairable at any cost he'd consider. He stripped it over 2 weekends in late April. The front axle was usable, 2 rear-wheel weights, a set of hydraulic fittings in good shape, a steering column worth keeping. He sold what he couldn't use to a collector in Bartholomew County who dealt in old Deeres. Got $90 for the parts lot. The 620 had cost him $75. He came out $15 to the good. The corn planter took the longest. Dell worked on it 4 evenings a week through April, 3 hours each evening. The shop floor was cold enough that his knees ached on the concrete by the second hour. He'd assessed 8 salvageable row units at the auction. He ordered replacement seed discs, closing wheels, and depth gauge wheel assemblies from an aftermarket supplier in Illinois. 3 items were in stock. One had to be sourced from a dealer in Ohio, which added 9 days to the wait. Total parts cost $214. By May 3rd, all 8 row units were functioning. He hitched the planter to the Oliver 1800 on May 5th and drove to the south field. The ground was ready. He ran a test pass across 200 feet. Every row unit dropped seed. No skips, no plugging, no failures. He planted 160 acres with it through the second week of May. Not a single row unit failed in the field. Word had moved through Decatur County in the weeks after the Perkins auction. It always did. By the time the Oliver was running, word had made its rounds. The Perkins auction had been discussed at Milligan's Feed and Supply on Route 46, at the grain elevator, at least twice at Whitfield Farm Supply. The conclusion reached Dell through his brother-in-law Gale, who worked at the county assessor's office. The county's verdict, Dell Crane had spent good money on scrap iron. The specific version was that Carl Whitfield had told 4 separate customers the Oliver wouldn't run again, that the corn planter was fit for the ditch, that Dell would spend his summer staring at a rust pile in his shed. Gale passed this along on a Wednesday evening in early May. By then, the Oliver had been running for a week. Dell didn't say anything about it. Didn't need to. Total equipment investment to that point, $365 at auction, $77 for the Farmall M head job, $37 for Oliver points and carburetor, $214 for planter parts, minus $90 from the 620 parts sale. Net cost for a working 3 tractor fleet and a functional 4-row corn planter, a $603. A comparable new 4-row corn planter at Whitfield Farm Supply that spring, $9,400. The summer of 1981 brought the worst interest rate environment in 40 years of Indiana farming. The prime rate hit 21.5% in June. Farm loan rates followed it up. By August, new equipment notes in Decatur County were carrying 19 and 20%. Roy Grisham was paying 18.5% on his $14,800 international note. Annual interest on that note alone, $2,738. His other notes pushed the total annual debt service on his operation to $31,400. Dell Crane's equipment debt, 0. He added the disc harrow to his tool lineup that summer. Spent 3 Saturdays replacing 11 of the 32 blades. New blades from an implement supplier in Shelbyville, $88. The harrow worked. He disced his fields with it through September. Total equipment investment by end of 1981, $1,691. By late June, Dell's fields looked the same as his neighbors' fields. Corn coming up in rows, ground worked and planted. No visible difference between what a rebuilt Oliver pulled and what a new International pulled. The corn didn't know the difference. The bank statements did. Dell's neighbors were carrying $31,000 to $62,000 in annual debt service on equipment alone. Dell was carrying 0. He ran the numbers in the notebook that summer. If grain prices stayed where they were, his neighbors needed 108 to 115 bushels per acre at corn to break even. Dell needed 71. That 40-bushel gap was entirely interest. Nothing else. The summer of 1982 was dry in Decatur County, not a failure year. Dry enough that yields fell below break-even for several operations on the eastern side of the county. Roy Grisham's corn came in at 87 bushels per acre against a break-even of 109. Frank Elmore's soybeans were worse. Bud Stillwater's hadn't planted his full acreage. Said the ground hadn't been ready. People at the elevator had a different read on why. Dell's corn came in at 83 bushels per acre. He didn't make money on corn in 1982. He didn't lose any either. His equipment was paid for. His land was paid for. He owed nothing to anyone. He paid his property taxes in October. Insurance in November. Had $3,900 left in the farm account at the end of December. Not a good year. A survivable one. The men at Milligan's Feed talked about the dry summer all through October. They talked about grain prices. They talked about what the lenders were saying. The conversations had a different tone than they'd had in 1980 and 1981. Less forward-looking. More careful. Dell went to Milligan's on the first Tuesday of each month for feed supplies. He listened more than he talked. He kept the notebook current. The column of numbers kept telling him the same thing it had been telling him since July 1980. By March of 1983, Frank Elmore had called his lender twice about restructuring. The conversations hadn't gone Frank's way. Dell heard this from Gail. Bud Stillwater stopped coming to the grain elevator on Tuesday mornings. He'd been there every Tuesday for 11 years. Dell first noticed the absence in late October 1983 and wrote the date in his notebook without comment. Carl Whitfield had 2 repossessed tractors sitting on his lot by October 1983. He hadn't had repossessed equipment on that lot in 11 years. By the end of November, he had 4 machines behind the chain-link fence on the north end of Greensburg. One of them was the 1975 International Harvester 1066. The one Roy Grisham had bid $14,800 for 2 years and 7 months earlier. Dell drove past Whitfield's on a Thursday in late November on his way to the elevator. He saw the 4 machines through the fence, recognized the International at the near end, drove on. He didn't stop. Didn't need anything from there. Roy Grisham's 320 acres went to the Decatur County Bank in February 1984. The sheriff's sale was set for April 3rd. Dell went to the sale, stood at the back near the property line, said nothing to anyone. The north 80 acres sold first. Flat ground, good drainage tiles installed in 1974, 2 miles east of Dell's home place. He knew this ground. Had farmed adjacent to it for 23 years. He bid $680 per acre. One other bidder. Dell went to $705. The other bidder stopped. 80 acres at $705, $56,400 total. Roy Grisham had paid $1,100 per acre for that same parcel in 1980. Dell had $14,800 in the farm account on April 3rd. He paid it as a down payment. Financed the balance at 14.5% through the Farm Credit Office in Greensburg. Remaining note, $41,600. Annual interest, $6,032. He drove home from the sale, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote the numbers in the notebook. He now had 260 acres. The corn planter from the Perkins auction planted the new 80 acres that spring without a failure. The Oliver 1800 pulled the disc harrow across former Grisham ground in April. Dell had replaced 5 more disc blades over the winter at $4 each. Total harrow investment across 3 years, $108. In the fall of 1984, Frank Elmore's 220 acres went up in a sheriff's sale. Dell bought the 60 acres that ran along his south fence line, paid $710 per acre, $42,600 total. Financing arranged in 3 days. He now had 320 acres. It was not how he'd planned to get to 320 acres. He'd planned to farm his way there over 15 years. The crisis had compressed that. He wrote about this in the notebook in a single sentence. Didn't write it as a victory. Wrote it as a number. It was a number. That was all it was. Bud Stillwaters held on until the spring of 1985. The bank took 280 acres in April. The sale was held on a rainy Wednesday in May. Bud stood at the back of the crowd the way Dell had stood at the Grisham sale a year before. Dell bid on the 120 acres that bordered his eastern fence line, got them at $695 per acre, $83,400 total. He was at $167,400 in land notes by the summer of 1985. No equipment debt anywhere in the column. His debt service on the land notes totaled $24,273 annually, high, manageable on the additional acres now under his operation. He had 440 acres. He'd started with 180. In October 1985, Oosta Farm ownership loan rates dropped to 11.5%. Dell refinanced 2 of his 3 land notes that month, reduced his annual debt service by $3,100. He used that freed-up money to buy a used 1978 John Deere 6600 combine, found it at an estate sale in Bartholomew County in December 1985. Paid $8,400. Needed a feeder house chain and new concave grates. Parts, $640. He had a working combine for $9,040 total. The 1968 John Deere 55 he'd been nursing along since before the Perkins auction was parked permanently in October 1984. He sold it to the Bartholomew County collector for parts. Got $385. Net cost for upgrading to a functional harvest operation, $8,655. He wrote it in the notebook. Gale mentioned in January 1986 that Whitfield Farm Supply had changed its financing terms. Carl Whitfield was requiring 30% down on any purchase over $8,000. Too many customers had defaulted through 1983 and 1984. The business had been running well below its 1981 pace. Dell had bought nothing from Whitfield since 1979. The parts he needed, he ordered direct. The last farm bordering Dell's ground changed hands in March 1987. The Hendrick family had worked 300 acres on the western edge of the county for 38 years. Raymond Hendrick had not taken equipment loans. His problem was a 1979 land note that came due at the wrong time. The lender would not restructure. The sale was on a Tuesday. Dell bought 160 acres of Hendrick ground at $720 per acre, $115,200 total. He had the financing arranged before he left the sale. He now had 600 acres. He'd started with 180. 6 years. The county assessor's office updated the ownership records that April. Gale mentioned it at Sunday dinner. Said Dell was now among the 8 largest landowners in Decatur County by acreage. Dell said he'd have a look at the records sometime. He did not look at the records. He had 620 planted acres to prepare for spring. The corn planter needed 2 new depth gauge wheels before planting season opened. He'd ordered them in March. They arrived April 4th. Cost, $44. He put them on that evening. The corn planter from the Perkins auction was still running in the spring of 1987. 6 full planting seasons. Dell had replaced parts incrementally across those years. Seed discs, $66. Press wheel arms over 2 seasons, $44. Closing wheel bearings, $38. Total maintenance across 6 seasons, $148. The planter had cost $800 at auction. Parts to restore, $214. 6 seasons of maintenance, $148. All in, that corn planter had cost $162 to acquire, restore, and keep running across 6 seasons. A comparable new 4-row planter in Indiana in 1987 listed at $9,600. Roy Grisham's 8-row planter, financed in 1981, sat on a dealer lot in Columbus through the summer of 1987. It sold at auction in September for $4,100. Carl Whitfield attended the Decatur County Agricultural Association meeting in August 1987. Dell was there. Whitfield sat 3 rows forward and to the left. Dell sat near the door. The county extension agent presented land ownership data for Decatur County. Listed parcels that had transferred during the crisis years of 1983 through 1987. listed current holders by acreage. Dell's name was on the list. At some point during the presentation, Whitfield turned around in his seat. He may have been looking for someone. He may have seen Dell in the back of the room. Dell was looking at the handout. They did not speak. The Greensburg Daily News ran a business conditions piece the following month. It mentioned that Whitfield Farm Supply had let go 2 salesmen in 1986 and was operating at 34% below its 1981 revenue peak. Gale clipped the article, handed it to Dell at Sunday dinner. Dell read it, set it on the table, said the pork roast was good. Dell Crane farmed in Decatur County until 2001, retired at 67. Turned the operation over to his son Warren, who had worked alongside him since 1993. Warren still farms the same ground. He kept Dell's approach. Never bought new equipment in his first decade running the operation. Dell had kept 23 notebooks by the time he retired. Every purchase, every yield, every debt service calculation, every part's cost, written in pencil on yellow paper. Warren kept all 23. They're in a drawer in the farmhouse office in Greensburg. The Oliver 1800 Dell had bought for $250 at the Perkins auction was retired from field work in 1994. The engine had given all it had to give. Dell parked it in the back corner of the machine shed and called it a parts tractor. Warren stripped what remained in 2001 when Dell retired. Sold the pieces. Got $340. The tractor had paid for itself more times than Dell had written in any notebook. The corn planter ran until 1998. 17 seasons. Dell replaced it that fall with a 6-row used planter from an estate sale in Rush County. Paid $1,100 for it. He did not buy new equipment. Warren does not buy new equipment. Warren's son Travis joined the operation in 2019. Same approach, same county, same drawer in the farmhouse with 23 pencil-written notebooks inside it. Travis opened it once in the winter of 2020. Took out the first one, read the first page. First entry, July 1980. Interest rate observations. A column of numbers. What $40,000 at 18% costs per year. He put the notebook back. He already knew what it said. The ground Dell Crane loaded onto a trailer on a cold March morning in 1981, rust and all, is still being worked. Same family, same notebooks, still paying.